Greetings, everyone. As we ran out of time today, in me setting us up for the social and economic transformations that were taking place amidst the changing political scene of the mid-19th century, I was not able to get to my introduction of Mill and my summary of the readings that we had. So here we are. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on John Stuart Mill here. So as I said, John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. He's the son of James Mill, who, as I said, was an associate of Jeremy Bentham, who we met on Wednesday of this week. And of course, so he was sort of brought up with this rigorous intellectual environment, and he was meant to kind of carry on the utilitarian tradition. His philosophical trajectory, though, is going to be somewhat different. He's going to actually wind up being sort of a reformer of Benthamite utilitarianism. So Mill's major philosophical difference lies in his efforts to reconcile individual liberty with the utilitarian principle. He's very concerned with the rights of the minority being respected. We talked about how Benthamite utilitarianism sort of tends toward majoritarianism. And especially in On Liberty, this is Mill's primary concern here. So he is a utilitarian, but he's very concerned with individual rights, more so, I think, than Bentham. So he's trying to reconcile the idea of individual liberty with societal progress, which, as we said, the progressive liberals, the progressive liberals, those who were breaking off from the classical liberal tradition, were not concerned necessarily with any a priori restraints on what government could do. It was simply a calculation using that principle. Does it increase overall utility? So, initially, unsurprisingly perhaps, having been raised in his father's house and under his tutelage, Mill embraces the principle of maximizing happiness as the foundation of moral and political decisions, just like Bentham. However, after kind of a profound sort of crisis in his early 20s, Mill begins to critique what he sees, I think rightly, as the reductionism of Bentham's framework. And he recognizes the need to account for qualitative differences, for example, in pleasures and the moral worth of individuality. And this marks a clear departure from Bentham's purely quantitative analysis, which we talked about. I assigned you both of those readings from Bentham. So Mill's reformulated utilitarianism, which he was going to present to try and address what he viewed as the deficiencies in Bentham's theory, he presents in 1861 in his book Utilitarianism, which your first reading came from. And he argues that intellectual and moral pleasures hold greater intrinsic value than mere physical pleasures. So Mill's assertion is that, quote, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, sort of encapsulates this idea of more refined, qualitatively different types of pleasures. And his broader contributions to ethics here were just one part of this. So in On Liberty, which was the second of your readings, the selections there, this was 1859. This is kind of it's still one of the foundational texts. Hayek, who we'll see later, references on liberty all the time. And this was written against the backdrop of Victorian Britain. And this was the society that was most grappling with the problems of industrialization, social reform, expanding political enfranchisement. Britain is really on the cutting edge of that in Europe. On Liberty articulates a very powerful defense of individual freedom. Mill asserts that personal liberty is essential for human flourishing and societal progress, arguing that the only justification for restricting freedom is to prevent harm to others, a principle that he refers to as the harm principle. So for Mill, liberty was not an end in itself, but a means of enabling individuals to pursue their own vision of the good life. Okay, so this is, again, he is not one of the classical liberals. He championed the value, though, of free thought, free speech, which you saw in the second part of the reading from On Liberty, warning against the tyranny of the majority, a phenomenon he saw as a growing threat in democratic societies. His impassioned defense of individuality and dissent reflects his belief that intellectual diversity and competition and debate are necessary for the discovery of truth and for the advancement of society. So, in terms of political economy, which again, this was how to technocratically organize the state in order to create more economic progress, Mill was very interested, for example, in, oh, sorry, I bumped that. This was 1848. He argues in Principles of Political Economy, which was not one of your readings, but just for your background here, he's seeking to blend classical liberal principles of free trade with non-state intervention with a concern for societal justice. And we talked about how those bonds of social obligation that had been a part of the feudal framework and the early modern framework were gone now. And he's trying to find a way to mitigate what he can visibly see are some of the harder edges of early capitalist industrialization. We talked about, kind of picture of Charles Dickens type scenery there. They were contemporaries. He's arguing then for the beginnings of state intervention to address inequality and to ensure basic welfare. We talked about the French experimentation with national workshops, how we were only a couple decades away from Bismarck introducing the welfare state in the New Germany. So Mill is going to be a vocal proponent of progressive taxation and policies like land distribution, early social welfare programs. And so he's demonstrating that willingness, that desire to adapt liberal doctrines to suit what he sees as the negative outcomes of capitalist industrial development. And so this synthesis between economic liberalism and social reform, as I said, it's really going to influence later thinkers, particularly Hayek, who actually makes peace with the welfare state in On Liberty. So, much like Bentham, he was pro the equality of women, critiquing sort of their legal and social subjugation, and he was arguing that this was necessary for justice and for societal progress. And he actually is one of those who, like Bentham, asserts that the differences between men and women result more from societal conditioning than from any innate nature. And so very much a precursor of the later, particularly second wave feminist thought, although the first wave of feminism is just starting to coalesce around this time. So in terms of trying to locate Mill within kind of the broad narrative of Western philosophical thought, and specifically Western political thought that we've been charting this semester, Mill occupies, again, a very interesting transitional period here. In the 1600s and 1700s, we were transitioning from sort of the pre-modern, early modern, still recognizably feudal, trending towards absolutist monarchy here, toward a lot of the classical liberals and the enlightened despots who were trying to use rationalism and reform towards progressive liberalism here in the early 19th century. So, building on that utilitarian tradition begun by Bentham, he expanded and, in many ways, tried to humanize its ethical framework, emphasizing the importance of individuality, creativity, and moral autonomy, at the same time emphasizing sort of a positive obligation, and not just the obligation not to do harm, but to actually do certain acts of good. So, he's sort of taking what he views as useful from people like Locke and Smith, and trying to adapt it. He viewed it as needing adaptation to suit the challenges of modern industrial society. So, Mill's liberalism is going to be critiqued by people like Marx, who didn't see him as understanding that capitalism was the root cause of the problem, and that he was sort of missing that aspect there. Later libertarian thinkers, of course, will criticize him, people like Rothbard, for opening that middle road, which ultimately leads to socialism. If you open that door to government intervention, that door will be forced open wider and wider, and more power will accrete to the state. So he's a very important thinker. And we dealt with selections from two of his most famous works, Utilitarianism and then on liberty. So let's begin then with the reading on, utilitarianism, which was chapter 2, first chapter 2, what utilitarianism is. So Mill here is providing a comprehensive explanation of the principle of utility, which should have been very familiar to you, the quote, greatest happiness principle. And he addresses sort of common misconceptions about utilitarian ethics. And this is always a good idea. You want to start off right away by addressing criticisms of the work that already exists, kind of steel man what's going on here, and sort of one by one refute these or correct them or whatever the case may be. And that's what he starts with. So he is also tweaking and refining the ideas of Jeremy Bentham, though, expanding on the concept of utility as the foundation of morality. Remember, Bentham was simply concerned with a quantitative measure, and Mill here is expanding it, creating more subtlety, more nuance here to say, well, we need to look at the quality of these experiences. So, first, Mill defines the doctrine of utilitarian as the ethical principle that actions are right to the extent that they promote happiness and wrong insofar as they produce the reverse of happiness. So remember, this is a consequentialist doctrine here. We are looking at the consequences of the thing that happens. So happiness in this context is understood as pleasure and the absence of pain. So he is following his predecessor here. So, Mill clarifies that utilitarianism evaluates actions based on their consequences, specifically their ability to maximize overall well-being. And the emphasis on consequences here is going to be, again, very, very important. Mill insists that utility should be the ultimate criterion for determining moral righteousness because it aligns with humanity's natural pursuit of happiness. And so again, you can hear it in the Jeffersonian preamble to the Declaration of Independence, right? The pursuit of happiness, right? So, again, that's why he's an interesting bridge here. So, again, probably the most significant contribution to utilitarian thought that comes out of on utilitarianism is his attempt to make qualitative distinctions and to find a way to systematically provide a framework for doing this. Because he's basically responding to critics who accuse utilitarianism of reducing human life to the pursuit of base or animalistic pleasures. And Mill argues that not all pleasures are of equal value. Pleasures of the intellect, such as those derived from reading, from art, from moral reflection, are qualitatively superior to bodily or sensory pleasures like eating or physical discomfort. And Mill is going to support this claim by appealing to the judgment of those who have experienced both types of pleasure. And according to him, individuals who have had access to higher intellectual or moral pleasures consistently prefer them to lower ones, even if the former come with greater challenges or risks. As he writes, it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So this distinction is critical here. So, this, of course, creates a little bit of a problem here. And we talked about the measurement problem that Bentham tries to address in various aspects of his work. Mill stresses that the principle of utility requires equal consideration of everyone's happiness. And he admits that there are difficulties in measuring this. And he's also concerned already here with talking about not just, he's trying to balance society and the individual here. So he is demanding that each person's welfare be given the same weight in moral calculations, and that the utilitarian standard that the greatest amount of happiness is that for the whole. He's basically arguing that if you are, to use de Tocqueville's phrase, self-interest properly understood, he's saying, look, if you understand that your happiness relies on other people's happiness, you will try to work to do things that will raise their happiness because it will raise everyone's general standard of happiness. So again, this is a highly rationalist Enlightenment doctrine here. So he's arguing that individuals should cultivate a sense of moral duty that transcends personal preferences, trying to align their actions with the broader good, the common good. So let's see some of the other common misconceptions. Pursuit of pleasure is a lowly goal. Yes. So he addresses the idea that you can't constantly be happy. Contending that you don't need perpetual happiness, you're just trying to more minimize suffering and achieve a balance of pleasures over pain, kind of a sort of, when you average everything out, it'll be like a moderate level of happiness in the aggregate. Of course, one of the obvious criticisms was that it created excessive moral demands. Again, the classical liberals, for example, would say you are putting too much of a burden on individuals, forcing them to do these things that they don't want to do. So, And then, of course, one that still, I think, kind of just intuitively speaks to human beings today is that it reduced all human relationships to just calculation, that it was dehumanizing. Mill counters that utilitarianism is not incompatible with strong personal attachments or virtues like love and compassion, and that it is really a tool for sort of the bureaucratic elite to manage society. And so already you see this, and I talked about this the other day, like the progressive liberal is the type who believes that through bureaucratic management of the state, through rational management, through the scientific method, through reason, that society can produce better and better individuals and constantly be raising people's standard of living. So, Mill distinguishes between things like morality and the motivation of the agent. And he asserts that utilitarianism, again, evaluates actions based on their consequences. So it creates this interesting kind of gray area where someone could do something that on net increases human well-being or human happiness, even if they didn't really mean to, and that would still be a good thing on their part. So he addresses all sorts of interesting things like that. So chapter 2 of utilitarianism really is a cornerstone of Mill's ethical philosophy in defining sense of the utilitarian tradition. And so again, he's addressing misconceptions, refining the principle of utility qualitatively. That's the big thing to hold on to here, and articulating that distinction between higher and lower pleasures necessarily. So Mill's is a more sophisticated and humane version of utilitarianism, in my opinion, and his emphasis on individuality, intellectual development, it's a more complex, higher form of the sort of simplistic, more hedonistic version of utilitarianism that was still sort of in the work of Bentham here. So, chapter 4 then was the other reading from On Utilitarianism here. Mill here tackles the question of whether and how the principle of utility can be proven. And while acknowledging that moral first principles cannot be proven in the same way as mathematical or empirical truths, Mill argues the principle of utility is supported by evidence derived from human experience and psychological tendencies. And he sets out to establish the plausibility and compelling nature of the utilitarian standard. First, by asserting that ultimate principles, the foundation of ideas upon which other reasoning is built, much like axioms in mathematics or other self-evident truths of thought, that this also applies to utilitarianism. And it doesn't mean that it's arbitrary, just like 2 + 2 is not arbitrary. Their validity instead can be demonstrated by appealing to the evidence and shared experience of humanity. No amount of research or anything like that can prove that 2 + 2, that there is some foundation for 2 + 2 being 2, but we can see that if we accept the definitions of these things and we operate on the basis of this, that operating on the basis of 2 + 2 = 4 will lead to positive outcomes, whereas, acting like they equal 5, if that makes sense, would not lead to the same kinds of good outcomes. So it's a principle rooted in observable human behavior and motivation. So basically all he says is that, look, the proof of utility just involves showing that happiness is a desirable end, and that it serves as a foundation for evaluating moral actions on that basis. So it's hardly perfect, but to establish that happiness is an ultimate end, again, he appeals to empirical observation. Quote, the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. So again, very practical, appealing to human experience. And he argues that happiness, defined as pleasure in the absence of pain, is universally desired by human beings. The empirical claim rests on the idea that individuals naturally seek pleasure and avoid pain as a matter of instinct and of rational calculation, and that happiness, therefore, is the only thing inherently valued as an end in itself, rather than as a means to anything else. So that's critical there. So, Mill acknowledges, for example, that individuals may pursue things like wealth, power, fame, but that these are only sought because they contribute to the individual's sense of happiness. So they are not valued for their own sake, they are valued as a means to happiness. And that's how he arrives at happiness as being the desirable end goal. So, and as a standard for morality. So, Mill is going to argue that, therefore, all of us obtaining that will lead to the greatest amount of happiness, and that it's a question of balancing the individual and the collective happiness. So, And he, of course, like some of the ancients that we looked at, is going to view the cultivation of certain types of what they would call virtue as being beneficial to increasing the overall level of happiness in society. And so it is the role of the state, in his mind, to produce these sorts of values, because it will increase collective happiness. So, as for On Liberty, we had the introductory and we had the, On Liberty of Thought and Discussion. Yes, okay, so, in the introductory, John Stuart Mill here is going to establish the central purpose of his work. He's going to explore the nature and limits of authority and liberty in society, and he's going to emphasize the importance of protecting individual freedom against both governmental overreach and societal pressure. So Mill argues that liberty is essential for personal and social progress, and he tries to provide a framework for understanding when and how society can justifiably exercise control over individuals. So, he starts by stating that this particular work focuses on civil or social liberty, which he defines as the nature and limits of power that society can legitimately exercise over the individual. And he frames the problem of liberty as a timeless struggle between the individual and authority, rooted in historical battles against oppressive rulers. Again, we go back to the Commonwealth men of England, who essentially argued that everything which is good for the people is necessarily bad for their rulers, and everything that is good for the rulers is necessarily bad for the people, contrary to their liberty. So Mill warns that the problem of liberty has evolved in modern societies, that it's grown more complicated because we don't necessarily have one single ruler, and that in democratic systems, the threat to liberty no longer comes from the rulers, but also from society itself. Remember de Tocqueville, arguing that society itself can become tyrannical and oppressive. And so he comes up with the quote, tyranny of the majority, where public opinion, rather than a single authority, can become the source of oppression. So he's arguing here that we need to not only safeguard individual liberty from the state, but also from social pressure. So, and again, this should sound familiar from what we heard from de Tocqueville's analysis of democracy in America last week. So, this brings us to the harm principle. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So according to this principle, individuals should be free to act as they choose, provided their actions do not harm others. Society and the state have no legitimate authority to interfere with personal behavior unless it directly infringes on the rights or well-being of others. So, Mill explores the implications of the harm principle for the relationship between individuals and society, and he argues that society must respect individual liberty in three key domains: freedom of thought and of expression. He warns that suppressing opinions, even those deemed false or dangerous, impoverishes the intellectual development of society by stifling debate and the pursuit of truth and critical thinking. Second, freedom of tastes and pursuits. Individuals must have the liberty to pursue their own way of life, even if others disapprove of their choices. As long as their actions do not harm others, people should be free to experiment with lifestyles, values, and interests. Lastly, freedom of association. Mill argues that individuals should be free to associate with others for any purpose, as long as the association, again, does not harm others, because the freedom to associate supports the flourishing of diverse communities and ideas within society. So, Mill provides a philosophical justification for his emphasis on liberty and argues that protecting individual freedom is not just a moral imperative, but a practical necessity for human progress. Again, the progressive liberals are interested in the progress of society. It's part of what is driving the nation-state forming process here. It's the idea that these are progressive instruments for the betterment of the people. So, liberty is going to be part of this. So obviously, some later writers will disagree. Mill is one who's saying, yes, we can have the state, you can have bureaucratic management, creating safeguards against this and that, and interfering in economic matters and personal matters and things of that nature, if it's justified, but that we need to respect individual liberty, and he believes that there is going to be a possibility of balancing these things. So, okay. So, in this, he's not concerned with the internal governance of institutions like families, private associations. He's strictly talking about public social interactions in terms of social pressure, just to be clear there. So, let's see here. Okay. And then in chapter 2, he's going to provide a very robust defense of his promotion of the liberty of thought and of discussion. So, the 4 key arguments for freedom of expression here are as follows. So, argument number 1, and this is worth, I think, going over here because I know I already touched on it, but this is something that we see today with, sort of the censorship regime and, quote unquote fake news and whatnot. So let's just consider what Mill has to say here. So these are his 4 main arguments to support his claim that opinions should never be suppressed. 1, that suppressed opinion may be true, in fact. If an opinion is suppressed, society loses the opportunity to evaluate its truth. Even if the majority believes an opinion to be false, they could be mistaken. And of course, Mill has many examples that he brings out, the most famous being Galileo and Copernicus. So, a false opinion may contain partial truths. So, again, just bring it out in the open debate, helping refine it. We can find that bit of truth in there. Third, an unchallenged truth, something that is in fact true, risks becoming dogmatic and losing its meaning if it is not open to debate and criticism and robust discussion in society, and that it becomes a dead dogma rather than a, quote, living truth. Challenging truths and robustly defending them, finally, prevents intellectual stagnation, which he views as kind of the death of society. So, and which would be bad for social progress. Again, social progress is what he is concerned with. Human happiness is part of progress. People will be more and more happy as the state progresses, as their standard of living grows higher, as they become more enlightened. So, again, he is a forerunner to modern progressives. So, that's really all I have for you there on Mill. We won't be coming back to the utilitarians, but I think that's a good introduction to them between Bentham and Mill. Next week, Marx, and from there we're going to do some talking about nationalism, Nietzsche, and that will be taking us close to the end of term. So thanks so much. Enjoy your break, and I look forward to seeing you all a week from Monday.